There was a time when she believed she had found it. The it that poets hinted at in hushed metaphors, the it that mystics sang about with trembling eyes, the it that her restless seeking had chased through dogma and detachment and endless hours of meditation. It arrived not with thunder, but like morning light through thin curtains, subtle, golden, and impossible to ignore. One day, the world cracked open, and everything, trees, faces, shadows, gleamed with a strange, unbearable aliveness. The veil lifted, and for the first time she saw not with eyes, but with something deeper. She felt it in her chest. The world wasn't broken. It was burning with beauty. She was euphoric, intoxicated by presence. The past evaporated, and the future seemed irrelevant. There was only now, and it pulsed with a kind of grace she had only ever read about in sacred texts. It felt like coming home, like remembering something ancient and true. The mind quieted. The body softened. Every breath felt like prayer. And so she assumed, as many do, that this was it. This was the state she would live in now, forever tethered to that clarity, that depth. She whispered to herself that the journey was over, that the seeking had ended. What else could there be beyond this golden hum? But Marie-Louise von Franz would have warned her. She would have spoken of the danger in mistaking the spark for the fire, or the opening for the arrival. Because the psyche, in its vastness, does not yield its secrets in one ecstatic moment. It only shows the door. Still, the first days felt like grace incarnate. Old fears vanished. She forgave what she thought she'd never forgive. Even her face in the mirror seemed softer, illuminated from within. She cried often, not from pain, but from the sheer magnitude of beauty. The way sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, the way a stranger's laugh echoed like a hymn. She thought this was awakening. She thought she had awakened. But something deeper was stirring. Not a storm, not yet. Just a faint vibration beneath the peace, an almost imperceptible tension that made the silence feel not only sacred, but slightly strange. The ecstasy was real, but it wasn't rooted. It hadn't descended into the body. It hovered just above the skin, and soon it began to fade. She didn't understand it then. How could she? When you're bathed in light, you don't imagine the dark. But individuation, true awakening, is not an escape into illumination. It is a descent. And though she didn't know it yet, the shimmer she clung to was only the prelude. What came next would not sparkle. It would strip. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like mist gathering on the edges of a mirror. The clarity she once carried with her, the radiant presence, the vivid now, began to blur. Not in dramatic collapse, but in quiet withdrawal. Morning still came, coffee still brewed, emails still arrived. But something within her no longer rose to meet them. It wasn't sadness, not yet. It was more like a soft erosion, a subtle dislocation between the self she had always been and the one now waking inside her, wordless and unfamiliar. She moved through her days like an echo. The laughter she once performed with precision now felt hollow in her throat. The clothes in her closet looked like costumes from a play she no longer remembered auditioning for. Friends called and she answered, but from a distance, as if watching herself from behind glass. They asked how she was. She said, "Good," and wondered who they were really speaking to. Marie-Louise von Franz spoke of this stage not as regression, but as necessity. The psychic architecture that once held a person together must loosen its grip to make room for what is truer. Personal myths. Those subtle, often unconscious stories about who we are and what life expects of us begin to dissolve. Not all at once and not with violence, but like ink fading from a page. And when they do, what's left is not immediately revelation, it's emptiness. Spacious, silent, strange. She didn't yet know how to explain it, that the goals which once gave her structure now felt irrelevant, that the opinions of others, which had once carved the contours of her choices, no longer carried weight. It wasn't apathy, it wasn't detachment, it was something deeper. The scaffolding of identity, roles, labels, ambitions had begun to unfasten, and yet no new form had emerged to take its place. The books she once devoured now gathered dust. Her journal stayed closed. Meditation brought not peace, but a formless, hovering silence she didn't know how to trust. There were no visions now, no insights, only the unsettling sensation of floating in a life that no longer seemed to fit. And yet, von Franz would say, this was progress. This was the work. Because to individuate is to let the old self fall apart without rushing to assemble a new one. It is to resist the urge to return to something familiar for the sake of comfort. The ego wants story. It wants identity. But the soul moves more slowly. It waits. It listens. It allows for the unraveling. She did not yet know who she was becoming, only that she was no longer who she had been. And in that quiet, bewildering space, the first seeds of transformation took root. It was not a dramatic exit. Desire did not vanish in fire or fury. It simply receded, like the tide pulling back from the shore without warning or reason. One morning, she woke and felt it, the stillness where drive used to live. There was nothing wrong, nothing tragic. And yet, she no longer cared, not in the way she used to. The plans pinned to her calendar felt weightless. The dreams she once nurtured now sat dormant, untouched by urgency. She tried, at first, to summon it again, to will herself into movement, to remember why any of it had mattered. But the rituals that once stirred her, morning affirmations, vision boards, productivity lists, had turned hollow. They no longer whispered promise. They made no sound at all. This was not depression, though the world would have named it that. It was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something else, something deeper and less definable. Her inner engine had gone quiet. The motivational current that once surged through her veins, powered by ambition, recognition, and personal striving, had ceased. And in its place was a strange neutrality, not numbness, not despair, just stillness. Marie-Louise von Franz would have understood. She would have called this the interim, the pause between two psychic centers. The ego, exhausted from years of performance, had finally stepped down. But the self, the deeper source, had not yet risen to speak. And so the in-between yawned wide and silent. There was no roadmap, no new dream to chase. Only the quiet fact that the old ones no longer fit. She walked through her life like a ghost in her own story. Tasks got done, but without soul. Conversations happened, but she felt disconnected from their center. The question wasn't, what do I want, but why want anything at all? The flame that once pushed her forward had burned clean through, and the ashes left behind offered no direction. She tried to explain it once, to someone she trusted. "It's not that I'm lost," she said. "It's that the reasons I used to move no longer feel true." But truth, it seemed, did not come with clarity. It came with quiet. It came with waiting. And so she waited, not passively, but attentively. There was no hunger to fix, no impulse to rebuild, just a deep, intuitive knowing that something had ended, that the ego had driven as far as it could, and now it was time to sit in the silence until another voice, softer, older, was ready to rise. This was the vanishing of false desire, the sacred pause before authentic movement, and in its emptiness a different kind of longing began to whisper. Not for more, not for success, but for alignment, for truth, for whatever comes next when the need to prove anything finally dies. There was something unfamiliar about the quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of urgency. She no longer felt pulled to define, to achieve, to present. Life had slowed, but not in the way people often fear. It wasn't boredom. It was depth without edges, space without destination. As if her inner world had shifted from a narrow hallway into a cathedral with no ceiling. She didn't know how to navigate it yet, but something within her recognized this spaciousness. It felt ancient, like a forgotten room she had always belonged to. Marie-Louise von Franz spoke of the psyche not as a singular entity, but as a layered and living constellation. The ego, so long at the center of the stage, was just one voice, and not the most profound. The soul, she taught, was not interested in performance. It did not shout. It whispered in images, in instincts, in dreams that arrived like riddles. And now, with the ego finally quiet, those whispers began to echo louder. She began to notice things. How certain words struck chords deep in her chest while others passed through her like wind. How her dreams became more vivid, stranger, filled with symbols she could not explain but somehow understood. The surface self, the one who planned and achieved and strove, no longer felt like the core. She wasn't breaking down, she was breaking open. But without the old hunger, she felt disoriented. If the ego no longer wanted, and the soul did not demand, then what was left to guide her? Von Franz would say this is the threshold where real psychological work begins. Not in fixing, not in becoming better, but in listening. And the language of the soul requires a different kind of attention. You don't chase it. You make space for it to appear. She began to live in smaller moments, not because she had given up, but because grand plans no longer felt necessary. She watched how her body responded to decisions. She noticed how silence affected her mood. The psyche, she realized, was not just a mind. It was a whole field of experience, some of it conscious, much of it not. And the soul lived not in goals, but in gestures, in resonance, in the soft yes that came without explanation. There was no map for this kind of life. The ego had always wanted maps. The soul moved more like water, shifting, flowing, waiting. And she was learning, slowly, to follow it. Not to control it, just to notice where it wanted to go. In the space between psyche and soul, she no longer asked, "What should I do?" She asked, "What is calling me?" And though the answers came slowly, they came with a strange peace. Not clarity, not certainty, but a feeling, deep and unmistakable, that she was finally beginning to listen to the right voice. It didn't feel holy. It felt hollow. She had expected stillness to arrive like a blessing, like the quiet embrace after a long storm. But instead, it came with the weight of fog. Thick, slow, formless. The days lost their edges. Time bled together in soft grays. She would sit at the edge of her bed in the morning, not in despair, but in a strange suspension, as if she'd forgotten what came next. Not because she didn't care, but because no impulse arrived to move her forward. She tried to name it: burnout, rest, limbo. But none of those words held the truth. This wasn't a break. It wasn't a reset. It was an unfamiliar terrain, one where neither past nor future had any authority. The old motives had died quietly, and the new ones hadn't yet been born, and so she waited, not with patience, but with a kind of still resignation, unsure whether she was being prepared for something or simply emptied out. Marie-Louise von Franz would have understood. She wrote of the necessity of the gap, the liminal expanse between old and new psychic forms. When the structures of the former self dissolve, something must hold the space while the psyche reorganizes. But this holding isn't glamorous. It doesn't feel like growth. It feels like nothing, like walking through fog without a lantern. She noticed how the world resisted this phase. Friends asked if she was okay. They suggested vitamins, retreats, something to get her back on track. But she wasn't off track. There simply was no track anymore. The road she had followed had crumbled behind her, and no new path had appeared. And the culture, so obsessed with speed and progress, could not make peace with her pause. At first, neither could she. She questioned her stillness. She feared she was wasting time. But beneath the anxiety, something deeper stirred. A recognition that this was not failure. This was sacred arrest. She wasn't lost. She was being unmade. This kind of standstill, von Franz would say, is not an interruption of the journey. It is the journey. It is the psychic crucible where old identities burn away, and the soul waits for something more authentic to emerge. Nothing about it looks productive. There are no breakthroughs, no visible signs of evolution. Only quiet, only space. And so she learned to sit in it, not to escape it or analyze it, but to allow it. The pause wasn't punishment, it was preparation, a sacred threshold between stories. The stillness didn't speak in affirmations or insights. It spoke by stripping away everything that wasn't real. In this soft paralysis, she began to understand. Life wasn't asking her to move. It was asking her to listen. And in that vast, unmoving silence, something inside her finally exhaled. There was a darkness now, not loud or violent, but steady and consuming. It didn't bring fear. It brought a deep, leaden silence. She could no longer feel the thread of her own becoming. The shimmer that had once ignited her path was gone. In its place was weight, a thick gravity pressing inward. No light, no spark, just a still, unrelenting black. She would have called it depression once, but this was different. It didn't ache in the way sorrow does. It didn't scream or plead. It just was. A deep internal winter where nothing grew and nothing moved. Friends worried. They offered words like low point or emotional slump. But she knew this was something else. It wasn't her sadness. It was her spirit collapsing into itself. Marie-Louise von Franz called it nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of the alchemical process, where the old self is reduced to ash. Not out of failure, but as sacred necessity. Before anything new can emerge, the former must disintegrate. The alchemists knew this. They saw transformation not as improvement, but as death before rebirth. To become gold, the lead must first darken, must break down into the most essential matter. And she was feeling that breakdown in her bones. There were no more stories to cling to, no more symbols of progress. She could not pretend. She could not perform. Even hope felt like an old coat that no longer fit. It wasn't despair, it was emptiness, but not the hollow kind. This emptiness had depth, it had presence. It was not absence, it was incubation. Von Franz taught that this stage is the most feared because it offers no guarantees. No one can tell you how long the darkness will last, or what will rise from its depths. but she also knew it was the most sacred. Because in the nigredo, the ego surrenders its illusions. It cannot trick its way out. It cannot decorate the void. It must simply remain there, stripped, quiet, waiting. And so she waited. She let herself darken. She let the old dreams rot. She stopped reaching for meaning and allowed herself to be held in the unknowing. It was not comfortable. It was not poetic. It was a crucible. But she could feel it working, slowly, imperceptibly, on some level deeper than thought. The blackness wasn't an end. It was the alchemical womb. And something was forming there, not in the light, but in the hidden heat of surrender. In the quiet ruin of who she had been, the raw material of what she would become was gathering. Not ready to speak, but ready to be born. It felt like everything was dissolving. Not violently, not all at once, but slowly, with the silent inevitability of decay. She could no longer feel herself as she once had. The familiar thoughts, the reflexive emotions, the sense of identity she had curated and carried, they began to disband like old leaves loosening from a tree. And beneath it all was something darker, not sinister, but absolute. A heaviness that didn't pull her down, but folded her in. This was the descent she hadn't seen coming, the stage no one wrote about in radiant tones. It was not the bright side of awakening, not the mountaintop moment. It was the underworld, the sacred dark. Marie-Louise von Franz named this space nigredo, the blackening. In alchemical language, it was the first and most necessary stage of transformation, the breaking down, the rot, the death before the birth. But unlike depression, which suffocates with meaninglessness, this descent held a quiet purpose. It did not want to destroy her. It wanted to decompose what was false. There was no drama, no narrative, just the patient work of undoing. The psyche, von Franz would say, must submit to the fire of unknowing before it can be restructured. And so she surrendered, not because she was brave, but because there was nowhere else to go. Her old ambitions no longer stirred her. Her preferences dulled. Even joy seemed distant, like a language she once understood but had forgotten how to speak. Yet inside that void, something else began to move. Not forward, not outward, but deeper. She began to dream in strange symbols. Bones in the earth, snakes shedding skin, ancient doors with no handles. She didn't know what they meant, but she could feel their gravity. Von Franz believed that the unconscious speaks through image and symbol, and in nigredo, these symbols become guides. They do not fix the pain, but they frame it. They say, this is not madness, this is not failure, this is initiation. The soul is doing its work where the ego cannot follow, and so she learned to sit inside the black, to breathe through the undoing, to let the old myths about who she was and who she thought she had to be sink back into the soil. There were no answers here, only the slow alchemy of stillness and shadow. But something essential was happening. In the dark, the raw material of the self was being stripped clean. The fire of transformation was not loud, it was quiet and total, and in its heat, everything false began to melt. Not to punish, but to prepare. This was not the end of her story. It was the sacred decomposition from which the next truth could be formed. It began with flickers, irritation at nothing, tears without origin, memories she had long buried rising uninvited in the quiet hours. There was no warning, no event to explain their arrival. They simply came, one by one, like ghosts pressing their palms against the windows of her mind. The polished silence she had carefully maintained began to crack. Beneath it waited something raw, pulsing, alive. Anger, grief, longing. Things she thought she had healed, or at least outrun. But there is no outrun in the shadow. Marie-Louise von Franz had written that shadow work is not a task for the spiritually naive. It is the dangerous, necessary descent into the parts of the self we would rather not see. And now, in the darkened aftermath of her awakening, the shadow no longer knocked gently. It stepped fully into the room, demanding its place at the table. At first, she resisted. She tried to spiritualize it, to meditate it away, to name it illusion. But it stayed, and it grew heavier the more she denied it. There were images that returned again and again in dreams, childhood moments, buried shames, words she had spoken that still carried the weight of harm. Rage surfaced unexpectedly, not as violence but as fire in the throat, as a sharp edge beneath her breath. And with it came grief. A tidal grief that had no singular name, just an ancient ache she had carried quietly for years. This was not the pretty part of healing. It wasn't poetic. It was messy, inconvenient, and deeply human. And yet, von Franz insisted that it was here, in this confrontation with what is most unwanted, that the true alchemy begins. The shadow is not an enemy. It is a mirror, not to shame us but to make us whole. She stopped trying to fix it. Instead, she sat with it. She let the anger speak. She allowed the tears to come, even when they made no sense. She held the ache without naming it wrong. For the first time, she saw these pieces of herself not as failures, but as fragments that had been exiled by necessity. And now they returned, not for revenge, but for reintegration. No one had told her that awakening would require her to turn toward everything she had once turned from, that the light would expose not only beauty, but shadow, that the soul would not just lift her, it would ask her to kneel. And so she did. She knelt to her own sorrow. She bowed to the parts of herself she had deemed unworthy of love. And in doing so, something shifted. The darkness didn't vanish, but it softened. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt like truth. The shadow, it turns out, was not the end of her path. It was the threshold. And stepping through it, she began to remember what wholeness really meant. The world did not understand her silence. It met her stillness with discomfort, her retreat with suspicion. Friends asked what was wrong. Colleagues grew distant. Even those closest to her began to speak in worried tones, as though she had slipped into something dangerous, something in need of fixing. She smiled politely, but inside, their concern landed like a blade. Not because it hurt, but because it proved what she had come to sense more clearly each day. Stillness had no place here. Culture, she realized, was not built to hold the soul. It demanded motion, ambition, productivity, a visible arc of progress. The moment she stepped outside of that rhythm, she was marked. She wasn't accomplishing. She wasn't striving. So she must be lost, unwell, depressed. But the truth was something else entirely. She wasn't failing. She was listening. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote about the tragedy of a world that fears the inner journey, a world that glorifies doing but recoils from being, that praises surface clarity while pathologizing depth. There was a time when she would have believed them, believed that her quiet was a flaw, that her rest was regression. But now she saw it. They feared her pause because it reminded them of their own avoidance. She moved through public spaces like a ghost, no longer compelled to perform. She noticed how often people filled silence with noise, how every lull was quickly bridged by a scroll, a screen, a schedule. There was a panic underneath the pace, as if stillness might expose something they weren't ready to see. And perhaps that was true. Stillness reveals. It reveals the exhaustion beneath the smile, the loneliness beneath the connection, the hunger behind every polished goal. She wasn't above it. She had lived that way for years. But now she stood apart from it, and in doing so, she became invisible. Not out of isolation, but because she no longer played the role the culture recognized. She was not lazy. She was becoming. She was not depressed. She was descending into the deep, quiet chambers of the self, where no applause echoes and no external measure applies. There was grief in that, yes, the loss of shared language, the ache of not being seen, but there was also liberation. For the first time, she belonged not to expectation, but to truth. Von Franz warned that the soul cannot thrive in a world that only honors the visible. It will shrink, it will fracture, or it will go underground, waiting for the rare moment when someone is brave enough to follow it inward. She had chosen to follow. And though the world called it stillness, she knew it as a sacred movement, not forward, not up, but in. And in that descent, she touched something deeper than success. She touched her own becoming, and it asked nothing of her but presence. Just when she thought she had surrendered, fully, honestly, completely, the sabotage began. Subtle at first, a distraction here, a sudden doubt there, promises to herself broken without explanation. Old habits slipped through the cracks like smoke, undetected until she was breathing them in again. She wasn't being pulled backward. She was being twisted sideways, her path made slippery by something clever, elusive, and unnervingly familiar. It was not depression this time, not grief. It was mischief. She would sit down to listen inwardly and feel an urgent need to check her phone. She would feel the call to stillness, only to remember a task she had to complete. She would glimpse clarity, only to be flooded with a wave of ridiculous self-critique. A part of her was laughing. A part of her was mocking her efforts. This wasn't just resistance, it was personality. It had timing, it had humor, and it had power. Marie-Louise von Franz knew this figure well, the trickster, the shapeshifter, that ancient archetype who enters precisely when transformation deepens and structure dissolves. In myth, the trickster upends order, confuses roles, blurs the sacred with the absurd. In the psyche, it operates like an inner saboteur, not to destroy us, but to test the strength of what we're becoming. It pulls us from the threshold to ask, "Are you sure you want to cross?" She was not sure. That was the truth. And so the trickster had room to play. It told her stories, just plausible enough to believe, that this inner journey was a waste of time, that she was deluded, that she was missing life while trying to find herself. It made mockery of her depth, turned sincerity into theater. It didn't try to wound her, it tried to distract her, which, in its own way, was more dangerous, because it did so with charm. There were days she believed it. Days when she let herself drift from the edge, returned to the surface world with its clear roles and simple exchanges. It felt easier, more functional. But the soul does not forget. And even as she smiled and complied, something inside her felt the betrayal. Von Franz taught that the trickster appears not as failure but as a sign, that when this energy enters the psyche, it marks a turning point. The old order has been disrupted. The new has not yet stabilized. In this in-between, chaos becomes a kind of initiation, and so she began to watch it, this inner trickster, not with fear, but with curiosity. She named it when it came. She laughed with it sometimes, but she did not follow it, not anymore. because now she knew what it was guarding, the threshold, the real one, and behind it, a life not shaped by performance or escape, but by truth. The closer she came, the louder the trickster danced, and that, she realized, meant she was almost there. It started in dreams, soft, strange images that lingered longer than usual. A woman standing at the edge of a forest, eyes like mirrors. A stream flowing uphill, moonlight rippling on its surface. A voice, not heard but felt, humming through the marrow of sleep. She didn't understand them, but she couldn't forget them. They didn't ask to be solved, they asked to be listened to. And in the stillness of her inner descent, she found herself doing just that. By day, the world remained gray and hollow, but in the quiet hours, something new began to stir. Not clarity, not purpose, but presence. A presence that did not demand or explain. It simply was. Patient, rhythmic, older than language. She began to feel it in small moments. A tug toward water. An ache in the heart when she heard a particular song. The way her hands slowed while washing dishes. As if remembering something the mind had forgotten. This wasn't logic. It was intuition. And it was feminine. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote of the anima, the inner feminine in both men and women, as a mediator between consciousness and the unconscious. Symbolic femininity was not about gender, but about the soul's ability to feel, to imagine, to receive. Where the ego demanded understanding, the anima offered image. Where the ego sought progress, the anima offered rhythm. And now, in the thick of her unmaking, this inner feminine was finally rising to speak. The voice was not loud. It arrived like a current beneath thought, asking her to slow down, to notice, to stay. It whispered not answers but questions that opened her in places she hadn't known were closed. What are you resisting? What would happen if you let go? The questions didn't solve anything, but they softened her, and in that softening something new began to take root. She began to read old myths, not for escape, but for recognition. The goddess in exile, the maiden descending into the underworld, the wise crone at the edge of the village. Each story seemed to echo her own in quiet ways. These were not tales of conquest or heroism. They were stories of surrender, of descent, of transformation through feeling and fragmentation. The culture had taught her to lead with will, to measure with logic. But this new voice, the one wrapped in dreams and archetype, asked her to follow instead, to trust what she could not yet name, to let meaning emerge, not be constructed. It was uncomfortable, sometimes even terrifying. But it was also alive, more alive than anything she had felt in a long time. This was not about becoming someone new. It was about remembering something ancient. And through the feminine, she remembered not how to explain herself, but how to be with herself. Not how to fix the dark, but how to hold it. Not how to escape, but how to descend willingly into her own mystery. There was no map now, no signs, no milestones, no familiar voice telling her where to place her next step. The stillness had shifted into something stranger, a wide, unnamed space where nothing made sense in the old way, but everything felt undeniably alive. She had run out of reasons, out of questions, even out of the urge to understand. What remained was not clarity, but presence. And presence, she was learning, did not speak in words. She no longer asked, "What am I becoming?" That question belonged to the earlier stages, to the part of her still seeking to narrate the unfolding. Now, something deeper had taken hold, an inner gravity pulling her toward a truth she could not define. It asked for no explanation, only that she stay with it. not move, not resolve, just stay. Marie-Louise von Franz had warned that individuation was not a path of instruction, but of immersion, that the unconscious would not deliver answers on demand but would guide through image, symbol, impulse. To truly follow it, one had to surrender, fully, deeply, to what cannot be named. And this was that surrender, not dramatic, not spiritualized, just an unspoken agreement between her and something vast inside her. I will not run. There were moments she wanted to. The ego flared now and then, reminding her how easy it would be to return to the world of roles and certainty. She could go back, reassemble the old self. It would look like healing. It would feel like safety. But something in her refused. Not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. To go back now would be a betrayal of something sacred. And so she walked forward with no path. She let silence guide her. She let sensations take the place of decisions. She began to live by feel, subtle, intuitive, unprovable. A tug in the chest, a breath that lingered, a dream that hovered. These became her compass. Not because they made sense, but because they stirred something real. She learned to wait, not for signs, but for alignment, to do nothing until the moment said yes. There were no teachings for this, no diagrams or doctrines, only the slow revelation of something that had been inside her all along, waiting for the noise to subside. The world around her kept moving, kept measuring. But she was no longer trying to keep up. She had dropped beneath the current, into the quiet soil of her own soul. And in that silence, something ancient began to breathe again. She did not know where it was leading. She did not need to. Von Franz would say that the self, once awakened, does not shout from the mountaintop. It hums beneath the surface, drawing you into a life not dictated by reason, but by resonance. And all that's required is trust. Trust in what cannot yet be spoken, only followed. It didn't return all at once, the sense of meaning. It came in fragments, subtle, soft, like petals on water. A dream that lingered into the morning. A color that seemed to follow her from street signs to clothing racks to clouds. A sentence in a book that made her breath catch, though she couldn't explain why. Nothing had changed outwardly, but within something had begun to stir. Not a new purpose, not a plan, but a quiet, unfamiliar coherence. She was being spoken to, but not in words. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote that symbols are not decorative. They are alive. They are the language of the unconscious, sent forth when literal meaning can no longer carry the soul's weight. Now, in this inner clearing stripped of old desires, she found herself noticing these symbols everywhere. A crow landing on her windowsill and refusing to fly away. A song that seemed to echo a feeling she hadn't known she was holding. The sudden urge to draw spirals without knowing why. The mind might have dismissed it, but the soul did not. She no longer chased meaning. She let it arrive, image by image, impulse by impulse. And each time, when she honored the pull without questioning it, something shifted inside. She felt more whole, more real, less like she was assembling herself and more like she was remembering something long buried. This was the birth of what von Franz called the symbolic life, a way of being that does not separate the psyche from the world, but sees them as two expressions of the same unfolding. She began to live this way instinctively, not as a belief system, but as a response to what felt true. A leaf caught in the wind might bring her to tears. A stranger's passing gaze could carry the weight of a message. Nothing had to be explained. Everything simply was, radiant with inner resonance. The life she had once designed through vision boards and 5-year plans felt impossibly flat in comparison. This new life didn't rise from will. It emerged from participation, from noticing, from attuning to the invisible threads that connected her inner world with the outer one. Noticing when something lit up, listening when something went quiet, trusting the rhythm rather than controlling the beat. And there was grace in it. Not the shining kind, but the grounded kind. The kind that allowed her to breathe more slowly, to move more gently, to speak with less urgency. She had entered a dialogue with something greater than herself, and though she could not name it, she could feel its presence in every corner of her day. Meaning, she realized, was not something she had to create. It was something she had to allow. And as she did, the world began to speak back, not as instruction, but as invitation, not as answers, but as symbols. It had taken her a long time to understand that there was nothing to reach. The climb, the striving, the endless becoming. None of it led to what she thought it would. There was no summit, no final version of herself waiting at the top with answers and a perfect view. The self she had spent so long trying to construct was not meant to be finished. It was meant to be inhabited. What had once felt like a quest to arrive now felt like a returning. Not to the past, not to who she had been, but to something older, quieter, truer. A center that had always been there, beneath the masks, beneath the hunger. She began to feel it not as an identity, but as a presence. It didn't speak in declarations. It moved through sensation, through subtle knowing, through the peace that settled in her body when she was aligned with what felt honest. Marie-Louise von Franz had written that the self is not an ideal to strive toward, but an unfolding pattern, alive, organic, mysterious. It reveals itself not through force, but through relationship, not through domination of the unconscious, but through dialogue with it. The self is not a crown we wear, it's the deep root we grow into. Now she began to live from that root. She no longer measured her worth by achievement or clarity. She didn't need to know where the path was leading, only whether it resonated with that inner quiet. Choices no longer came from fear or performance. They came from alignment. And alignment wasn't perfect. It was moment to moment, a breath, a pause, a listening. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt real. And that was more than enough. There were still days when she forgot, when the noise of the world tried to reclaim her. But the difference now was that she knew how to return, not by fixing or striving, but by remembering, by dropping back into the body, into the breath, into the silence beneath the noise. The self didn't demand that she be better. It asked only that she be true. The more she surrendered to it, the more whole she felt. Not because her life was flawless, but because it was hers. Unscripted, unfolding, rooted in something that did not shift with opinion or approval. The self was not above her, waiting to be earned. It was within her, waiting to be trusted. She had not reached the end. There was no end. Only this quiet center, pulsing with life, guiding her not toward perfection but toward wholeness. And that wholeness was not something she had to chase. It was something she had to let live. She no longer needed the map. The need to know, to plan, to plot each step ahead had gone quiet. In its place was something softer, a devotion not to a goal, but to presence, to the slow, unfolding rhythm of a life lived from within. The questions that once haunted her, what am I doing? Where is this going? No longer held weight. They belonged to a mind desperate for control. Now she answered to something deeper. Direction had been replaced by listening. She moved not because she knew the outcome, but because something inside her hummed yes. Some days that meant doing nothing. Others, it meant acting with a clarity that came not from reason, but from resonance. The old pressure to perform, to achieve, to ascend. It had fallen away, not as an act of giving up, but of remembering what matters. There was nothing to become, only something to honor. Marie-Louise von Franz had written that the true path of individuation is never straight. It curves, it stalls, it disappears into darkness only to reappear in ways the ego could never anticipate. And yet it is real. It is the most real thing. She understood that now. Her transformation had not come in a moment, but in many. In the quiet, hidden places where she had chosen to stay instead of run, to listen instead of fix, to feel instead of escape. Her life had become symbolic, not in the abstract, but in the deeply embodied way the soul moves through image, through dream, through the quiet symbols that speak louder than reason ever could. A bird landing beside her during a moment of doubt. A phrase repeated by two strangers in one day. A dream she couldn't forget. These were not coincidences. They were conversations. And she had learned how to respond. It wasn't about being right anymore. It was about being aligned, not about outcomes, but about integrity. To act in harmony with that quiet inner truth, even if no one else understood, especially then. She didn't need clarity to move. She needed connection. To the self, to the unconscious, to the invisible threads that wove her experience into meaning. And when that connection was present, even the simplest gesture, lighting a candle, walking through the woods, saying no, became an act of devotion. This was not the end of the story. There were no endings now, only deepening, only continuing. But she knew in her bones that the life she had once tried to build through force was now being lived through presence. She had not found the answer. She had found the place where answers were no longer necessary. And in that quiet, undemanding space, she felt the most radical thing of all, peace. Not perfection, not certainty, but peace. A life guided not by direction, but by devotion. And that, at last, was enough.